Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent after my remarks to be followed by remarks from the senator from Louisiana, Senator Vitter.
Without objection.
Thank you. And I welcome Senator Vitter to, I welcome his cooperation and appreciate the work that he has done on the issue that I'm going to address and that he's going to address in terms of the concentration of the financial system in this country and what that means to the middle class, what it means to business lending for small businesses, what it means to the potential, again, of too big to fail, something Senator Vitter has been a leader on for a number of years, and sitting on this, that we sit together in the Senate Banking Committee and what we hope we can do together. More than 100 years ago, one of my predecessors in 1889, John Sherman, who actually lived in my hometown of Mansfield, Ohio, the only other senator from that city that's served here, Senator John Sherman, a Republican from Ohio, the author of the Sherman Antitrust Act, said, "I do not wish to single out Standard Oil Company. Still, they are controlling and can control the market so absolutely as they choose to do it. It's a question of their will. The point for us to consider is whether, on the whole, it's safe in this country to leave the production of property, the transportation of our whole country, to depend upon the will of a few men sitting at their console board in the city of New York, for there the whole machine is operated," unquote. At the time, Senator Sherman was speaking about the trusts, specifically Standard Oil, but other trusts, large, diverse industrial organizations with outsized economic and political power, not just economic power, but also political power. His words are as true today as they were then. Today, our economy is being threatened by multi-trillion, that's trillion-dollar financial institutions. Wall Street mega banks are so large that should they fail, they could take the rest of the economy with them. Instead of failure, however, taxpayers are likely, if this were to happen, to be asked again to cover their losses, to bail them out as we did 5 years ago. This is a disastrous outcome because it transfers wealth from the rest of the economy into these mega banks. It suspends the rules of capitalism. It perpetuates the moral hazard that comes from saving risk takers from the consequences of their behavior. Just as Senator Sherman spoke against the trusts in the late 19th century, today, people across the political spectrum, both parties, all ideologies, are speaking about the dangers of the large concentrated wealth of Wall Street megabanks. Another Republican in 2009, one a little familiar to a moderate audience, Alan Greenspan, said, "If they're too big to fail, they're too big." In 1911, we broke up, this is Greenspan speaking, former chair of the Federal Reserve. In 1911, we broke up Standard Oil. Maybe that's what we need to do today, unquote. If you thought the biggest banks were too big to fail before the crisis, I have news for you. They've only gotten better. They've only gotten bigger. These are the 6 largest banks and their growth patterns. 18 years ago, in 1995, these 6 largest banks' combined assets were 18% of GDP. 18 years ago, they were 18% of GDP. Today, they were over 60, combined assets over 60% of GDP. Over that time, 37 banks merged 33 times, becoming the 4 largest behemoths that now range, the top 4 now range from, the top 4 now range from 1.4 trillion in assets to the largest Bank of America and JP Morgan Chase, around 2.3, 2.4 trillion in assets. That's 2.3 thousand billion in assets. Since the beginning of the fiscal crisis, 3 of these 4 mega banks have grown through mergers by an average of more than 500 billion, $500 billion. The 6 largest banks now have twice the combined assets of the rest of the 50 largest banks. These 6 banks, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, their assets of those 6 banks are larger than the assets combined of the next 50 largest banks. Put another way, if you add up the assets banks 7 through 50, the bank that resulted would only be half the size of a bank made of the assets of the top 6. As astonishing as these numbers are, they don't tell the whole story. Many mega bank supporters argue that U.S. banks are small relative to international banks. But as Bloomberg reported last week, FDIC board member Tom Honig has exposed a double standard in our accounting system that allows U.S. banks to actually shrink themselves on paper. Under the accounting rules applied by the rest of the world, the 6 largest banks are 39% larger than we think they are. That's a difference of about $4 trillion. If that's the case, instead of being 63% of GDP under international accounting rules, these 6 banks are actually 102% of GDP. Let me say that again. The 6 biggest banks' combined assets are slightly larger than the size of our entire economy. When measured against the same standard as every other institution in the world, we see the United States, yes, has the 3 largest banks in the world. These institutions are not just big, they're extremely complex. According to the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, the 5 largest U.S. banks now have 19,654 subsidiaries. On average, they have 3,900 subsidiaries each and operate in 68 different countries. These institutions are not just massive and complex. I don't object so much to that. They are also risky. According to the regulator, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and I met with him today, none of these institutions has adequate risk management. Let me say that again. In stress tests, not one of the largest 19 banks has adequate risk management. It's simply impossible to believe that these behemoths will not get into trouble again. We saw what happened with one of the best managed of the banks, have a lot of employees, some 16, 17, 18,000 employees in my state alone. In one site, more than 10,000 employees in Columbus. J.C. Morgan Chase, a well-managed bank with a very competent CEO, but a bank that not so long ago lost $6 or $7 billion. That it's impossible to believe that they will not get into trouble again, and they'll not be unwound in an orderly fashion should they approach the brink of failure. If you don't believe me, ask the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Bill Dudley. He said recently, quote, "We have considerable ways to go to finish the job and to reduce to tolerable levels the social costs of a mega bank's failures." He said more drastic steps could yet prove necessary. Governor Dan Tarullo from the Federal Reserve threw his support behind a proposal first introduced by the presiding officer's predecessor, Senator Ted Kaufman, and me, and to cap the non-deposit liability of mega banks some 3 years ago in this body. These men are not radicals. They're some of the nation's foremost banking experts. History has taught us we'll never see the next threat coming until it's too late and almost upon us. When we passed Dodd-Frank, it contained tools the regulators can use to rein in risk-taking. Unfortunately, many of these rules have stalled. Most will not take effect for years. Don't think that's not because not just the economic power of the banks, but the political power in so often having their way in this city and with regulators all over the country. Dodd-Frank focuses on improving regulators' ability to monitor risk and enhancing the action that regulators can take if they believe the risk has grown too great. The last 5 years alone, we've seen faulty mortgage-related securities, we've seen foreclosure fraud, we've seen big losses from risky trading, we've seen money laundering, we've seen LIBOR rate rigging. Until Dodd-Frank rules take effect, the rest of us more or less stand by idly as megabanks take more risks that will almost inevitably and eventually lead to the near failure. We shouldn't tolerate business as usual, monitoring risk until we're once again near the brink of disaster. We should learn from our recent history. We should correct our mistakes by dealing with the problem head on. That means, Mr. President, preventing the anti-competitive concentration of banks that are too big to fail, whose favored status encourages them to engage in high-risk behavior. How many more scandals will it take before we acknowledge that we can't rely on regulators to prevent subprime lending, dangerous derivatives, risky proprietary trading, financial instruments that nobody understands, including people running the banks in many cases, and even fraud manipulation? Wall Street's been allowed to run wild for years. We simply cannot wait any longer for regulators to act. These institutions are too big to manage, they're too big to regulate, and they're surely still too big to fail. We can't rely on the financial market to fix itself because the rules of competitive markets and creative destruction don't apply to Wall Street megabanks as they do to businesses in Louisiana or Delaware or Ohio. mega banks, shareholders, and creditors have no incentive to end too big to fail. That's why they engage, and as a result, they'll engage in ever riskier behavior. They get paid out, in the end, they get paid out when banks are bailed out. Taking the appropriate steps will lead to more mid-sized banks, not a few mega banks creating competition, increasing lending, providing incentives for banks to lend the right way. If there's one thing that people in Washington love, it's community banks. Cam Fine, I know Senator Vitter has been very involved in working on helping community banks deal with regulations and other kinds of rules. Cam Fine, the head of the Independent Community Bankers of America, is calling for the largest banks to be downsized because he sees that his members, the community banks, they might be 50 million, they might be 100 million, they might be less than that in assets, but they are at a disadvantage. Just about the only people who will not benefit from reining in these mega banks are a few Wall Street executives. Congress needs to take action now to prevent future economic collapse and future taxpayer-funded liabilities. I want to, before turning it over, thank Senator Vitter, who recognizes this problem with an acuity that most don't have here, and in joining me in doing something about it. I'm pleased to announce today we're working on bipartisan legislation to address this too-big-to-fail problem. It will incorporate ideas put forward by Tom Honig and Richard Fisher and Sheila Bair. Senator Vitter will talk about his views in a moment. Mr. President, the American public doesn't want us to wait. They want to ensure that Wall Street mega banks will never again monopolize our nation's wealth or gamble away the American dream. To those who say that our work is done, I say that we passed 7 financial reform laws in the 8 years following the Depression, so it's clear there is precedent for not just one time, one fix, but a continued addressing of this problem until we know we have the strength of the American financial system in the way that it once had. Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank Senator Vitter for his work, and this began, I remember the first discussions Senator Vitter and I had about this were when he was asking some tough questions of a couple of regulators, maybe it might have been the Secretary of the Treasury, but a couple other regulators in capital standards, how important it was that, as he just mentioned, that these banks have the kinds of capital standards, have the kinds of capital reserves that are so important in making sure these banks are healthy. Probably most of us in our lives have seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life and know what happens when a bank isn't capitalized. That was a small town example of a bank that served the country in ways that community banks do, and it's a very different story today, perhaps. But I think his insight into the importance of capital reserves, and then we continue these discussions, and both came to the realization, as he pointed out, people all across the political spectrum, from some of my more liberal Democratic colleagues to people like George Will, and others who have been very involved as business leaders and speaking out on issues that really matter. So I thank Senator Vitter for his work. We will be working on legislation soon, and I'm hopeful that as more of my colleagues see how important this issue is, that we can continue to work together. And I yield the floor. Thank you, President. I, for one more moment, and then certainly yield to Senator Alexander. I appreciate very much Senator Vitter's words and comments and insight. And I want to just expand for 2 or 3 minutes on one thing he said about the subsidy that these largest 6 banks get. And you can see again from this chart that 18 years ago, these 6 banks' total assets were 18%, 18 years ago, 18% of GDP. Today, through mergers and growth and I would argue unfair competition in many cases, they're over 60%. But what Senator Vitter said, which I think is really important and to expand on a bit, is the subsidies these banks get. Bloomberg said it was about $83 billion a year in subsidies that they get because of government action or inaction, frankly. Interesting that $83 billion when we're talking about sequester today is about $85 billion, but that's not really relevant except putting in some context. But the reason they have this $83 billion subsidy, or $85 billion subsidy or so, 83, 84, 85, or they have the advantage when they go in the capital markets and getting advantage of 50, 60, 70, 80 basis points. That is, 80 basis points is 0.8%. Interest rate advantage is because the capital markets believe that these banks, that their investments in these banks are not very risky because they believe these banks are the markets believe these banks are too big to fail because they have the government backup for them. So if they have no risks, people are willing to lend money to them at lower interest rates. That's why the Huntington Bank in Columbus, Ohio, a large regional bank, about $50 billion in assets, or Key, a larger bank in Ohio, still though a regional bank, or the bank in Coldwater, Ohio, or Sycamore, Ohio, or Third Federal in Cleveland, banks that maybe are only a few tens of millions or maybe even up to $1 billion in assets, don't have that advantage. They pay higher interest rates when they borrow because the people who lend to them know that they're not going to get bailed out if something bad happens. It's only these 6 largest banks that have that advantage. So because they can borrow money on the markets at a lower rate, they are in effect being subsidized because we have not fixed this too big to fail problem for the nation's banks. So it's not a U.S. senator, a conservative Republican, or a progressive Democrat from Louisiana or Ohio making this case that they're getting this advantage. It's the capital markets that have decided, yes, these are too big to fail, so we're going to lend them money at lower rates than we'd lend to the Huntington or Key or Fifth Third or First Merit in Ohio. And that really fundamentally is the issue here, Mr. President, that it's our actions or inactions that have given these banks a competitive edge that nobody, through acts of government, whether you're liberal or conservative, should believe it should be part of our economic system and our financial system. So I thank Senator Vitter and yield the floor to Senator Alexander.